Earthquakes are powerful forces of nature with the potential to impact our state. Recent events within New Zealand and Japan underscore the significant damage this hazard can inflict. To better understand the risk to our state, we've come to the University of Western Australia, where Professor Maura Keep is working to develop a better understanding of these events.
Earthquakes are a sudden release of energy from stresses built up in the crust and mantle of the Earth. They usually occur at areas of very high stress, such as tectonic plate boundaries. And when the stress builds up to critical levels, the rocks, the plates will fail. And so the sudden release of energy generates the waves, which we feel are shaking. Most earthquakes occur at tectonic plate boundaries, and most people know what those are these days. Anywhere where you have sort of big chains of volcanoes as well, earthquakes and volcanoes go hand in hand in most places. So most of those are between tectonic plate boundaries, and we call those interplate earthquakes. And there's a second category of earthquakes that occur within otherwise stable continental interiors, and we call those intraplate earthquakes. Most of the interior of Australia and Western Australia are entirely intraplate. They're hundreds to thousands of kilometres away from plate boundaries. They're a concern because they're far less predictable. In an area of known earthquakes like an interplate boundary, such as the Indonesian margin near us, we know that earthquakes will occur on that margin. We can't predict when they're going to occur, but we know it's an area of known earthquakes. We can plot previous earthquake epicenters, and we know that earthquakes will occur along that margin at some point. We know when previous ones were. We have quite a lot of data as to when earthquakes have occurred, how much slip has occurred, what sort of damage they did. The intraplate earthquakes are far less predictable because they're not in any area of known, plate boundary activity, so they're a lot more random. And because of their unpredictability, they tend to catch people unawares, and they're usually in areas that are far more tectonically stable, so you're not necessarily expecting them. Scientists measure earthquakes with two scales. One is called the Richter scale. It's the one most people would be familiar with. You hear it on the news. And that measures roughly how long the ground shaking lasted for, how long people notice the ground shaking, and it's sort of a measure of relative energy release during the earthquake. And that scale is logarithmic, so a magnitude 7 earthquake would be 10 times greater than a magnitude 6 earthquake, for example. The other measure that we use for earthquakes is something called the modified Mercalli index, which is really a measure of what people feel during an earthquake. How much ground shaking was there, how much damage. That goes on a scale of 1 to 10, and you don't hear about that one so often in the news. So I think the Meckering earthquake in 1968 was modified Mercalli. I think it got to 6 right near Meckering, but most of Perth felt Mercalli 3 or 4. Western Australia is surprisingly seismically active for something that's supposed to be a stable plate interior. We actually have quite a number of smaller earthquakes going off quite frequently. There's a known area of very high seismic activity, very much on a line between Perth and Albany. We call it the Southwest Seismic Zone, and that's a linear zone where we have known earthquakes, hundreds and hundreds of them, usually magnitude 2s and 3s. Some people might feel them, other people might not even know they've occurred. Every now and again we have slightly bigger ones. We had magnitude 4s around Katanning in the last couple of years. There was one in Kalgoorlie that people felt. We've obviously had the Meckering earthquake and a couple associated with it at Kalingari and Kadoo from the late 60s to around 1990. And then in the northwest of Western Australia, we've actually had Australia's largest recorded earthquake, which was in Meebury. That was in 1941, and it was around a magnitude 7 on the Richter scale. But nobody really lived there, and there was no damage done, so it didn't. Most people didn't even know it had occurred. But so we actually have a surprising number of earthquakes. We also have a surprising number of relatively large faults, which have all recorded small earthquakes in recent times. There's a record of earthquake activity both on land and offshore in the petroleum fields. In the last 30 to 40 years, there's been quite a number of them. So Meckering is the one that most people in Western Australia will remember. That was in 1968. What was magnitude 6.8 on the Richter scale? It was very shallow under the crust, less than 5 kilometres, which caused an awful lot of ground shaking. The town of Meckering actually mainly fell down. Pretty much every building had some damage. It was fairly spectacular. The fault scarp actually cut the Great Eastern Highway. It broke the Perth to Kalgoorlie water pipeline. Nobody was killed. I think there were a few injuries. broken bones, and so forth. So that was one people remember, and the town was fairly flattened, and it was in an area where nobody really expected an earthquake to occur. So that's obviously one that people think of in terms of seismic activity relative to Perth. There was also some damage in Perth itself. There was some damage to various churches and other buildings, I think even in Maylands or Mount Lawley and places. I mean, quite close to the Perth CBD. So that one is obviously a major one. Another one would be there was the Mewberry earthquake. So that's Australia's largest recorded earthquake, around magnitude 7, but maybe 6.9 to 7.1. Because nobody lived in Mewberry and there weren't any big population centres, the effects of the earthquake went largely unnoticed. It didn't particularly do any damage. But it's sitting very close to the site of an earlier earthquake in that same region at Mount Naria in the late 1880s, which actually produced some effects at the surface. It offset some of the river drainage. It formed Lake Wheleen. So there is a history of some fairly large earthquakes in that region, and that's relatively close to Shark Bay, where we've also had some larger magnitude earthquakes in recent years. There was a magnitude 5.2 earthquake just off Shark Bay in about 2007, and a host of smaller ones in the region, 4.5 plus, within the last 5 or 6 years. So all of those will have an impact on infrastructure, on rail lines, on gas pipelines, on everything else. And with the infrastructure building up in the northwest, any of these events have the potential to cause some damage. Western Australia has an interesting earthquake risk because of the infrastructure. Because we can't predict these intraplate earthquakes, we have no idea when or where they're going to occur. And some of the normal rules that would guide other earthquakes in areas with known sort of earthquake activity don't really apply. We don't have the background of data to be able to predict which segments of faults have failed when. So they often catch us by surprise. Because of our vast infrastructure developments, we have, great risk to those sorts of things. There are active faults being discovered in the northwest region. Active faults just mean that they have had some seismic activity on them in very recent times. And if any of those have another earthquake on them, the effects could be quite severe because we have remote populations, we have remote communities, we've got all of this infrastructure. We have tens of billions of dollars worth of oil and gas infrastructure along the northwest coast. So all of those could be affected. So the risk is, in many ways, hard to predict. But if there was another Mewberry earthquake, for example, even in the same sort of region or further north and south, it could certainly have some impacts on communities, larger communities like Geraldton. If some of the faults on the northwest actually had big earthquakes, like the Shoal Island fault, which is the one that runs near Karratha, the impacts on the ports and the developments up there could be quite severe.